Miguel pulled his worn jacket tighter around his shoulders, shrinking deeper into the shadow of the abandoned storefront. From this vantage point, he had a perfect view of Carlos's barbershop across the street. The morning sun caught the rotating barber pole, sending red and white stripes spinning across the pavement. For weeks now, he had watched the daily rhythm of the shop unfold. The early morning regulars, mostly elderly men who preferred their routines as neat as their haircuts. The lunch rush of office workers squeezing in a trim between meetings. The after-work crowd, tired but relieved to sink into the comfortable leather chairs. Miguel knew their patterns better than they did themselves. He could predict almost to the minute when Mr. Rodriguez would arrive for his weekly Thursday appointment, or when the young lawyer from the corner office would rush in, always running 5 minutes late. From his position in the shadows, Miguel caught Carlos's reflection in the storefront window. The barber moved with practiced grace, his scissors dancing around his customers' heads. Every so often, Carlos's eyes would flick toward the window, catching Miguel's reflection in return. Miguel noticed how the barber never made it obvious, never stared directly at him. There was something gentle about his discretion. One morning, Carlos stepped out onto the sidewalk, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. Miguel tensed, ready to retreat deeper into the shadows, but Carlos simply placed the cup on the ground and walked back inside. The gesture was so casual, so free of expectation, that Miguel found himself frozen in place. The coffee went cold that day. The next morning, Carlos tried again. This time, he remained by the cup, his body language open and patient. "It's getting colder," he said, his voice carrying across the empty street. "Coffee helps." Miguel's feet seemed to move of their own accord, drawing him closer to the warmth emanating from the shop. The smell of coffee mingled with the familiar sense of aftershave and talcum powder. "I don't have any money," Miguel said, his voice rough from disuse. Carlos shrugged. "Who's asking for money?" "I'm asking if you want a coffee. And maybe," he gestured to Miguel's wild matted hair and beard, "a little cleanup? Free of charge." The interior of the barber shop was a shock of warmth and light after the gray street. Dark wood panels lined the walls, and old photographs hung in simple frames. The leather chairs looked impossibly comfortable, like relics from a more civilized time. Miguel's reflection haunted him from every angle, fractured across the wall of mirrors. He hadn't truly looked at himself in years. His hair hung in dirty ropes, his beard a tangled mess that helped hide his face from the world, and from himself. Carlos guided him to the chair with the same respectful attention he showed his paying customers. The other patrons watched with poorly concealed curiosity, but Carlos created a bubble of calm around them with his steady movements and quiet professionalism. The first touch of the scissors made Miguel flinch. Carlos paused, allowing him to settle. "Just a trim," he said softly. "We'll take it slow." Layer by layer, the years of neglect fell away. Dark hair dusted the floor around the chair. The straight razor glided through his beard, revealing the face beneath. Miguel kept his eyes closed, afraid of what he might see in the mirror. An elderly customer in the waiting area leaned forward in his chair, squinting at Miguel's emerging features. The man's intense gaze made Miguel's hands clench the armrests, his knuckles turning white. "You remind me of someone," the elderly man said, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the shop. Miguel's heart began to race, his fingers digging deeper into the leather armrests. The elderly man tilted his head, still studying Miguel's face with unsettling focus. Carlos, sensing the tension, positioned himself between Miguel and the man's line of sight. His movements remained smooth and practiced as he continued working, but there was a new protective quality to his stance. "These old photos always make me nostalgic," Carlos said loudly, drawing attention to the wall of black and white photographs. "Every face tells a story, doesn't it?" But the elderly man wasn't so easily distracted. He leaned further forward, his weathered hands gripping his cane. "It's remarkable, really. Something about the eyes. Miguel fought the urge to bolt from the chair. The cape around his neck felt suddenly constricting, like a weight holding him down. Through the mirror, he caught glimpses of his transformed face, a face he had spent years trying to hide. Other customers began to take notice, their casual glances becoming more deliberate. A woman waiting for her appointment picked up a magazine, but her eyes kept darting over its edges to study Miguel's reflection. The buzz of the clippers provided a steady soundtrack to Miguel's mounting anxiety. Each pass revealed more of his true features, stripping away the protective layer of anonymity he had cultivated on the streets. The face emerging in the mirror belonged to another life, another time. Carlos worked quickly now, perhaps sensing Miguel's growing discomfort. His skilled hands moved with purpose, putting the finishing touches on the transformation. But the damage was already done. Miguel could feel the weight of recognition heavy in the air. "You remind me of someone," the elderly man repeated, more insistent this time. "A face I saw years ago. In the newspaper, perhaps." The words hung in the air like a threat. Miguel's past, so carefully buried under years of careful invisibility, seemed to pulse just beneath the surface of his newly exposed skin. The simple act of accepting kindness had somehow turned into a trap, and now he sat exposed under the bright lights of the barber shop, watching his carefully constructed anonymity dissolve in the mirrors before him. "You remind me of someone," said the elderly customer, making Miguel grip the chair arms tightly. The elderly client's comment hung in the air like a heavy cloud, making Miguel's fingers dig deeper into the leather armrests of Carlos's barber chair. He tried to maintain his composure, but his reflection in the mirror betrayed the tension in his jaw. Carlos, sensing the shift in atmosphere, continued his work with steady hands, attempting to redirect the conversation. "So, as I was saying earlier, this neighborhood has changed quite a bit in the last decade," Carlos said, skillfully maneuvering his scissors around Miguel's ears. But the elderly man remained fixated, his eyes narrowing as more of Miguel's features emerged from beneath the unkempt beard. With each snip of the scissors and every pass of the razor, another layer of Miguel's carefully constructed disguise fell away. The transformation was gradual, but undeniable. Sharp cheekbones emerged from beneath the matted beard, and a strong jawline took shape where there had only been wilderness before. The other clients, initially absorbed in their phones or magazines, began to take notice. "It's remarkable," whispered a woman to her husband, "the difference a proper haircut makes." But it wasn't just the improvement they were noticing. As Miguel's true features became more apparent, the whispers took on a different tone. He could hear fragments of their conversations, though he pretended not to notice. "Doesn't he look like... Could it be... The resemblance is..." Miguel kept his eyes downcast, avoiding the mirror as much as possible. Carlos, ever the professional, maintained a steady stream of neutral conversation, acting as a buffer between his nervous client and the growing curiosity of the others in the shop. The bell above the door chimed, and a young woman walked in, her phone clutched in her hand. She was there to make an appointment, but the scene before her caught her attention immediately. She stood transfixed, watching as Carlos removed the last remnants of Miguel's beard. The transformation was near complete now. Where once sat a weathered street dweller, there now emerged a distinguished-looking man with features that sparked recognition in more than one observer. The young woman's eyes widened, and she unconsciously took a step closer, her grip tightening on her phone. Miguel could feel her gaze burning into him. He risked a glance in her direction through the mirror and immediately regretted it. There was something in her expression, a flash of recognition that sent a chill down his spine. Slowly, trying to appear casual, she raised her phone. Miguel saw the movement reflected in the mirror but couldn't react fast enough. The flash went off accidentally, filling the shop with a bright burst of light that made everyone jump. "I'm so sorry," she exclaimed, but her fingers were already moving across the screen. She backed toward the door, no longer even pretending to be there for an appointment. Carlos frowned. about to say something about photography without permission, but the young woman was already rushing out the door, her heels clicking rapidly against the sidewalk. Miguel sat rigid in the chair as Carlos applied the finishing touches. The elderly client had moved closer, no longer even hiding his intense scrutiny. Other patrons had abandoned any pretense of disinterest, openly staring now. When Carlos finally spun the chair around for the final reveal, Miguel found himself face to face with a ghost from his past. The man in the mirror was someone he hadn't seen in 10 years, someone he'd tried very hard to forget. His hands trembled slightly as he reached up to touch his smooth cheek, watching his reflection mimic the movement. Outside the shop, the young woman's phone buzzed continuously as she walked away. The photo was beginning to go viral. Through the storefront window, Miguel watched the young woman's retreating figure, her head bowed over her phone as she walked briskly away. The familiar face in the mirror seemed to mock him, and he could feel the weight of every stare in the barber shop pressing against his skin. A decade of careful anonymity stripped away in mere minutes. "There we have it," Carlos announced, brushing off some stray hairs from Miguel's shoulders. "What do you think?" But Miguel couldn't find his voice. The elderly client had risen from his seat and was now standing uncomfortably close, his weathered face creased with concentration. "I know who you are," the old man said softly, more to himself than to Miguel. "You're Helena's boy, the one from the newspapers." Miguel's throat constricted. Outside, more people were slowing their pace as they passed the shop, some doing double takes through the window. The young woman's photo was already making its rounds, spreading through local social media groups like wildfire. Carlos noticed Miguel's distress and quickly began removing the cutting cape, his movements efficient, but gentle. "Perhaps we should step into the back for a moment," he suggested, but it was too late. A small crowd had begun to gather outside the shop, phones raised like a wall of digital eyes. Some were comparing the scene before them to images on their screens, heads nodding in recognition. Miguel could hear the muffled sounds of their excitement through the glass. "It has to be him. Someone call Helena. After all these years..." The buzz of notifications filled the shop as phones lit up with messages and shared posts. Miguel's hand instinctively moved to his face, as if he could somehow hide behind his fingers, but the smooth skin beneath his touch only confirmed his exposed state. Carlos moved to stand between Miguel and the window, trying to shield him from the growing audience outside. "My friend," he said quietly, "what do you need?" But Miguel's eyes were fixed on something beyond the crowd. A car had pulled up hastily to the curb, and from it emerged a woman with silver-streaked dark hair. Even from this distance, even after all these years, he would know that silhouette anywhere. The phones of the onlookers started ringing simultaneously as the photo reached its viral tipping point, and Helena's familiar figure moved purposefully toward the barbershop door. The photo spread through social media like wildfire. At first, it was just another feel-good transformation story, a homeless man receiving a free haircut. But as the image circulated through local Facebook groups, comments began pouring in with an unexpected twist. "Wait, doesn't he look like... Could it be the Oliveira boy? He disappeared 10 years ago, didn't he?" The photo jumped from group to group, gathering hundreds of shares within hours. Each share brought new speculation, new theories, and more importantly, more eyes that might recognize the man in the barber's chair. Helena Martinez was preparing dinner when her phone chimed with a message from her best friend, Maria. "Helena, you need to see this right now." The message came with the viral photo attached. Her hands trembled as she opened it, the wooden spoon she'd been holding clattering to the floor. The face staring back at her from the screen was older, weathered by years on the street. But those eyes, she would recognize those eyes anywhere. They were Miguel's eyes, her son's eyes, the same eyes that had looked at her with such pain the last time she saw him, a decade ago. She rushed to the living room, pulling out the old photo albums she kept meticulously organized. With shaking fingers, she flipped through the pages until she found what she was looking for, Miguel's last photograph before he disappeared. Holding her phone next to the album, she compared the images. The bone structure, the slight asymmetry of his smile, the small scar above his right eyebrow from a childhood accident. It was all there. The memory of that last day crashed over her like a wave. Miguel had been distant, troubled. She'd attributed it to one of his moods, as she'd called them then, not understanding the depth of his struggles. The next morning, his bed was empty, and they never saw him again. Helena's fingers moved automatically, dialing the number listed in the social media post. Carlos's barbershop, the caption had said. The line was busy. She tried again and again. At the barbershop, Carlos was dealing with an unprecedented situation. His phone wouldn't stop ringing, and a small crowd had begun to gather outside, phones in hand, trying to peek through the windows. Miguel was still there, frozen in the barber's chair, watching as his carefully constructed anonymity crumbled around him. "I think we should close early today," Carlos said softly, noticing Miguel's growing distress. But before he could reach the door to flip the sign, more people appeared outside, pressing against the glass. Miguel watched in horror as strangers held up their phones, his own face reflecting back at him from countless screens. The transformation that was meant to be an act of kindness had become a spotlight he never wanted. He could feel the walls of his carefully constructed world beginning to close in. Then came the moment that shattered everything. A woman's voice, breathless and desperate, cut through the murmur of the crowd outside. Miguel's body tensed. He would know that voice anywhere. It was the voice that had sung him to sleep as a child, the voice that had pleaded with him to just try to be normal during his darkest days. Helena burst through the door, her eyes wild with hope and fear. For a fraction of a second, their gazes met through the reflection in the mirror. Miguel saw the recognition flash across his mother's face, saw her lips form his name, and felt 10 years of careful invisibility dissolve in an instant. Miguel rose abruptly from the chair, his eyes searching frantically for the back door as his mother's voice called out his name. "Miguel!" Helena's voice cracked with emotion as she pushed through the growing crowd. The sound of his name, his real name, sent shivers down his spine. How long had it been since anyone had called him that? On the streets, he was just Mike or Old Mike, identities he had crafted to keep his past at bay. More phones appeared in the windows, their cameras flashing like strobe lights. On social media, the story was evolving in real time. Local news pages had picked up the thread, sharing the before and after photos with headlines like "Missing Man Found After Decade" and "Viral Haircut Reveals Long-Lost Son." Carlos stepped between Miguel and the growing chaos, instinctively shielding him. "Everyone, please," he tried to address the crowd, but his voice was drowned out by the commotion. Helena was getting closer, her hands outstretched, tears streaming down her face. Miguel's heart raced as memories flooded back. The suffocating family dinners, the well-meaning but painful attempts to fix him, the endless parade of therapists who never quite understood. He had found peace in anonymity, in the simple life he'd built for himself on the streets. Now, with each camera flash and every step his mother took toward him, that peace was shattering. The back room of the barbershop seemed to shrink as Miguel backed away. Through the window, he could see a news van pulling up. Someone in the crowd was live streaming. His newly trimmed hair and clean-shaven face, meant to be a fresh start, had become a beacon drawing his past back to him. "Filho," Helena whispered, finally close enough to reach out and touch him. Her hand hung in the air between them, trembling. "We've been looking for you for so long." The walls seemed to close in. Miguel could feel the weight of a decade of questions, of explanations he wasn't ready to give, of a life he had deliberately left behind. His eyes darted to the back door, his escape route. In the streets, he knew every alley, every hidden corner. Out there, he could disappear again. Carlos watched the scene unfold, understanding dawning in his eyes. What had started as a simple act of kindness had unleashed something far beyond his control. He could see the panic in Miguel's eyes, the same look he'd seen in countless stray cats just before they bolted. The sound of reporters outside grew louder. Someone was knocking on the front window, calling out questions. Helena took another step forward, and Miguel could smell her familiar perfume, the same one she'd worn when he was a child. It was too much. In one fluid motion, born from years of surviving on the streets, Miguel turned and burst through the back door. He could hear his mother's cry behind him, could hear Carlos calling out, but he was already running. His feet knew these back alleys better than anyone, and within moments, he had vanished into the maze of urban shadows that had been his home for so long. Back in the barber shop, Helena collapsed into the chair her son had just vacated, her hands covering her face as she sobbed. Carlos stood helplessly nearby, while outside, the crowd continued to grow, everyone searching for a man who had perfected the art of not being found. Miguel rose abruptly from the chair, searching for the back exit, while his mother screamed his name. Miguel burst through the back door of Carlos's barbershop, his heart pounding against his chest. The familiar alleyways stretched before him like a maze he had memorized over the years. Behind him, Helena's voice pierced the air, calling out his name with a desperation that made his stomach turn. The sound of her footsteps echoed off the narrow walls as she tried to follow, but Miguel knew these passages better than anyone. Left, right, through the gap between the dumpsters, moves that had become second nature during his decade on the streets. He could hear her growing more distant, her calls becoming fainter until they were swallowed by the urban noise. Back at the barber shop, Carlos hurriedly ushered the remaining customers out, flipping the closed sign with trembling hands. Through the window, he could see the growing crowd of onlookers, their phones raised like beacons, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man from the viral photo. The memory hit Miguel like a physical blow as he ducked into an abandoned building he often used as shelter. He slumped against the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The day he left flashed through his mind, the carefully planned departure, the letter he never sent, the overwhelming weight of expectations he couldn't bear. Helena stood in the middle of Carlos's shop, clutching an old photograph to her chest. "He was always so quiet," she explained, her voice breaking. "We thought it was just a phase." She spread more photos across the counter, birthdays, graduations, family dinners, moments frozen in time before everything fell apart. Carlos listened intently, his professional facade cracking as he witnessed a mother's pain unfold before him. "He's been coming here for weeks," he offered. "Always at the same time, always watching from across the street." Outside, the story was spreading like wildfire. Street vendors discussed it over their carts, showing each other the viral photo on their phones. News vans began appearing at the corners, reporters rehearsing their segments about the mysterious homeless man who might be a long-lost son. Miguel could sense the shift in the air as he moved through his usual haunts. Eyes followed him now, whispers trailed in his wake. His freshly trimmed appearance, meant to be a simple act of kindness, had become a beacon drawing unwanted attention. Police officers interviewed Carlos while Helena sat nearby, years of missing person reports and unanswered questions heavy in her hands. "We just want to make sure he's safe," they assured her. But Miguel, watching from the shadows of a nearby building, felt the walls of his carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. The streets that had been his sanctuary for so long suddenly felt exposed. Every familiar face, every regular passerby could be the one to recognize him, to shatter the invisible barrier between his past and present. News crews swept through the areas known to be frequented by the homeless, their cameras' invasive eyes searching for his story. Carlos found himself torn between professional discretion and moral obligation. He knew Miguel's regular spots, had heard snippets of conversations about where the homeless community gathered, but betraying that trust felt wrong, even in the face of a mother's tears. Back in his hidden corner, Miguel gathered his few possessions with shaking hands. A worn backpack, a few changes of clothes, some carefully preserved documents he'd never had the courage to destroy. The city that had sheltered him for so long was becoming a trap. Faces from his past swirled in his mind. His mother's smile, his father's stern disappointment, the therapist who tried to help but never quite understood. The streets had offered him something they couldn't: freedom from expectations, from the suffocating weight of being someone he couldn't be. But now, as he watched more news vans arrive and social media continued to buzz with his story, Miguel knew that freedom was slipping away. His sanctuary was compromised, his anonymity shattered by a single photo and an act of kindness he should have refused. As his world crumbled around him, Miguel reached a decision. It was time to leave the city behind. He watched the increased movement on the streets from his vantage point in the abandoned building. Police cars cruised by more frequently now, their lights casting eerie shadows through the broken windows. Each passing vehicle made his heart race, knowing they were all looking for him. The afternoon sun began to fade, casting long shadows across the city. Miguel had spent years learning the rhythms of these streets, which corners to avoid, which shops would offer leftover food, which doorways provided the safest sleep. Now all that knowledge felt useless as his own face became his betrayer. Through a cracked window, he could see a group of reporters interviewing some of the other homeless people he knew. Some looked away, maintaining the unspoken code of the streets, while others pointed in various directions, perhaps tempted by the promise of reward money that had undoubtedly been offered. His phone, a basic model he kept for emergencies, vibrated in his pocket. Carlos had given it to him months ago, insisting he should have a way to call for help if needed. The screen showed multiple missed calls from the barber shop. Miguel's finger hovered over the button before he removed the battery completely. Night was falling, and with it came the realization that his usual sleeping spots were no longer safe. The media would be watching those areas now, hoping to catch him seeking shelter. The comfortable routine he had built over years had been destroyed in a single afternoon. He thought about Jason, another street dweller who had moved to the next city over last month. Jason had mentioned an abandoned warehouse where people could stay undisturbed. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than waiting to be found. As Miguel shouldered his backpack and prepared to leave the city that had been his home for the past decade, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in a store window. The face that looked back at him was a stranger, clean-shaven, hair neatly trimmed, looking more like the son in those old photographs than the homeless man he had become. And that was precisely the problem. While everyone was looking for him, Miguel took one final decision. It was time to leave the city behind. Miguel's weathered hands trembled as he gathered his few possessions from the abandoned building he'd called home for the past months. A worn backpack, a tattered blanket, and a small tin containing his most precious memories. That was all he had to show for his decade on the streets. The viral photo from Carlos's barber shop had shattered the careful anonymity he'd built around himself, forcing him to move once again. As he folded the blanket, his mind drifted back to that day 15 years ago. The sterile walls of the doctor's office seemed to close in on him as the psychiatrist explained his diagnosis: severe depression. The words had fallen like heavy stones in the quiet room, but it was his family's reaction afterward that truly broke him. "You just need to snap out of it," his uncle had said. "What do you have to be depressed about?" his father demanded. Only Helena, his mother, had remained silent, her eyes filled with a confusion that hurt more than any dismissive comment. Across town, Helena and Carlos had formed an unlikely alliance. They sat in the closed barbershop, spreading out a map of the city on the counter. "He usually stays in this area," Carlos pointed to a cluster of abandoned buildings. "The other homeless people respect him here." Helena's fingers traced the streets, trying to imagine her son sleeping in those cold corners. Miguel made his way to the bus station, keeping his head down. The new haircut that had exposed him now made him too recognizable. He approached the ticket counter, but before he could purchase a ticket, he noticed two elderly women staring at him, whispering and pulling out their phones. His heart raced as he backed away, disappearing into the crowd before they could take another photo. Carlos visited the usual gathering spots of the homeless community. Each person he met had a story about Miguel, how he'd shared his food, helped someone find shelter during a storm, or simply listened when no one else would. "He's one of the good ones," an old man told Carlos. "Doesn't deserve all this chaos." The memory of his diagnosis day continued to haunt Miguel. He remembered sitting at the dinner table, his mother trying to coax him to eat, while his father ranted about attitude problems and lacking discipline. Nobody understood that the darkness inside him wasn't a choice or a phase. It was a crushing weight that made every breath feel like a battle. In Miguel's childhood home, Helena stood in his untouched room. Everything remained exactly as he'd left it. The made bed, the organized desk, the row of books. She pulled open a drawer and found a stack of notebooks. Opening one, she discovered pages filled with his inner struggles, words he'd never been able to say aloud. Tears fell as she finally began to understand what she'd failed to see all those years ago. Miguel sought help from his street friends, but many had already seen his photo on the news. Local stations had picked up the story, painting it as a heartwarming tale of reunion, completely missing the complexity of his situation. Every familiar face now looked at him with a mixture of recognition and pity. Carlos learned more about street life as he searched. He discovered that many of his assumptions about homeless people had been wrong. The community had its own rules, its own support systems. Miguel hadn't just survived here, he'd found a place where he could exist without pretense. Going through Miguel's old letters, Helena found one he'd never sent. "The streets don't judge me," he'd written. "Here, I don't have to pretend to be happy. Here, I can simply be." As evening approached, dark clouds gathered overhead. Miguel nearly got spotted by a group of teenagers who'd seen his story on social media. He ducked into an alley, his heart pounding. The first drops of rain began to fall as he realized he needed shelter. Looking around, he recognized the neighborhood. He'd wandered unconsciously back to his old street. The heavy rain kept him trapped just meters from his old life, while lights flickered on in his mother's house. Thunder rolled overhead as Miguel pressed himself against the cold brick wall, watching the warm glow from his mother's windows paint rectangles of light on the wet pavement. Each flash of lightning threatened to expose his position under the narrow overhang of a neighbor's garage. The rain had soaked through his jacket, but he couldn't risk moving to better shelter, not when he was so dangerously close to his past. Through the curtained windows, he could see shadows moving inside the house. Helena's silhouette passed by, and for a moment, he was transported back to countless evenings watching her prepare dinner before the darkness in his mind had driven him away. He could almost smell her signature beef stew, could almost hear her humming as she worked in the kitchen. A police car crawled slowly down the street, its headlights sweeping the rain-slicked sidewalks. Miguel pressed himself flatter against the wall, holding his breath. The search for him had spread further than he'd imagined. The car passed without stopping, but the close call made his heart race. He needed to move, to find somewhere else to wait out the storm. But his legs wouldn't cooperate. The rain intensified, drumming against metal gutters and creating rivers along the curbs. Miguel watched as a cat darted across the street, seeking shelter under a parked car. He envied its simple solution to the weather. His own options were rapidly diminishing as the storm showed no signs of letting up. A light suddenly flicked on in the front porch of his mother's house. Miguel froze, watching the door open slightly. Helena stood in the doorway, peering out into the darkness. Had she seen him? Had some instinct told her he was near? The moment stretched like elastic, ready to snap. The heavy rain poured down, forcing Miguel to stay just meters from his former home, while the lights in his mother's house continued to shine like beacons in the storm. The rain poured mercilessly over the city streets as Miguel huddled against a wall, his eyes fixed on the familiar house before him. Every drop that fell seemed to echo the beating of his heart, each flash of lightning illuminating the windows of what was once his home. Through the curtains, he could see the warm glow of lights inside, a stark contrast to the cold darkness that surrounded him. Helena stood by her kitchen window, absent-mindedly washing dishes, when a movement caught her eye. Years of watching the street, hoping for a glimpse of her son, had made her sensitive to every shadow that passed. She froze, her hands dripping with soapy water, as she spotted a figure seeking shelter from the downpour. The scene transported her back to their last family dinner, 10 years ago. Miguel had sat quietly at the table, pushing food around his plate while everyone else chatted about their day. She remembered now, with painful clarity, how she had dismissed his silence as mere moodiness. If only she had known it would be their last meal together. Miguel pressed himself further under the insufficient cover of a nearby marquee, cursing his luck. Of all the places in the city where he could have been stranded by this storm, it had to be here. The newly trimmed hair on his neck felt foreign, exposed, making him more vulnerable than he'd felt in years. He watched as Helena's silhouette moved away from the window, and for a moment, he allowed himself to breathe. The front door creaked open. Helena stepped out onto the porch, protected from the rain by the overhead awning. Her hand clutched the doorframe as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Even through the curtain of rain, their eyes met, and a decade of separation crystallized into a single moment. Miguel's instinct was to run, but the torrential downpour had turned the streets into rivers. He took a step backward, his shoes sliding on the wet pavement. "Miguel?" Helena's voice carried over the storm, fragile yet clear. He could see Carlos's car approaching in the distance, its headlights cutting through the rain like a spotlight. Trapped between his past and present, Miguel felt the walls of his carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. Helena moved forward, stepping into the rain without hesitation. Her house slippers were immediately soaked, but she didn't seem to notice. Each step she took toward him felt like an eternity, water streaming down her face, making it impossible to tell if she was crying. Carlos pulled up to the curb, emerging from his car with an umbrella. He assessed the situation quickly, positioning himself between mother and son, not as a barrier, but as a bridge. Miguel's voice cracked, the first word he'd spoken to his mother in 10 years dying in his throat. A flash of lightning illuminated the scene, and in that brief moment, Miguel was transported back to the night he left. The crushing weight of expectations, the suffocating silence of misunderstanding, the overwhelming darkness that had consumed him. He had packed a small bag, written a note he knew would be inadequate, and slipped out while everyone slept. Helena took another step forward, her hand reaching out. Miguel flinched backward, colliding with the wet wall behind him. The physical contact he had avoided for so long seemed unbearable now. Carlos moved closer, his steady presence offering a sense of stability in the chaos. "Let's all get out of this rain," he suggested, his voice gentle but firm. The emotions Miguel had bottled up for a decade burst forth like a dam breaking. Tears mixed with rainwater on his face as he finally spoke, his voice raw with pain. "You never understood that sometimes family hurts the most." Helena's hand fell to her side as if struck, the truth in Miguel's words hitting harder than any physical blow could have. The rain continued its relentless descent, but now it seemed to slow around them, each drop suspended in the gravity of the moment. "The barber shop is just around the corner," Carlos offered, his umbrella extended toward Miguel. "We can talk there, or not talk at all. Your choice, Miguel." The mention of choice, something Miguel had fought so hard to reclaim on the streets, made him pause. His shoulders, tense from the confrontation, relaxed slightly. He looked at his mother, really looked at her for the first time since their eyes met. The years had left their mark, new wrinkles around her eyes, gray streaks in her hair that hadn't been there before, a weariness in her posture that spoke of sleepless nights and endless worry. "I don't need shelter," Miguel said. But even as the words left his mouth, a violent shiver betrayed him. The storm had soaked through his clothes, the cold seeping into his bones. Helena took a step back, creating space rather than closing it. This simple act, this recognition of his boundaries, made Miguel's throat tighten. It was the kind of understanding he had craved all those years ago. 10 minutes, Carlos suggested, his voice barely audible above the storm. "Just until the worst passes. Then you can go wherever you want." A car passed by, its headlights illuminating the scene like a spotlight on a stage. Miguel saw his reflection in a nearby window, clean-shaven, hair properly cut, and for a moment, he hardly recognized himself. The man staring back at him existed somewhere between his past and present, between the son who left and the survivor who emerged. Helena hugged herself against the cold, but she made no move to return to the warmth of her house. She would stand there all night in the rain if that's what it took. Miguel knew this about her, had always known it. Her stubbornness, which had once felt suffocating, now reflected something else. A mother's unconditional love, however imperfectly expressed. Lightning split the sky again, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. In that moment of illumination, Miguel saw something he had missed before. Fear in his mother's eyes. Not fear of him, but fear for him. Fear that he would disappear again, melting into the shadows of the city like he had done so many times before. Carlos took a small step forward, positioning his umbrella to cover both Miguel and Helena. The three of them stood there, sharing that small circle of shelter, while the storm raged around them. It was a physical manifestation of what Carlos had been trying to create all along, a safe space where past and present could coexist. Finally, Miguel nodded. A slight movement, almost imperceptible, but in it was contained a decade of running, of hiding, of trying to escape the pain that had driven him to the streets. 10 minutes, he agreed, his voice hoarse. Just until the rain stops. The rain continued to pour outside the small awning where Miguel, Helena, and Carlos had taken shelter. The sound of water hitting the pavement created a rhythmic backdrop to the heavy silence between them. Miguel's hands trembled slightly as he wrapped them around the warm coffee Carlos had managed to procure from his shop. "The depression started long before I left," Miguel finally said, his voice barely audible above the rain. "It wasn't just sadness. It was like drowning while everyone around me was breathing normally." Helena's face crumpled as she listened, decades of misunderstanding washing over her features. She reached for the wall behind her to steady herself, her other hand pressed against her mouth. "I tried to tell you," Miguel continued, his eyes fixed on the steam rising from his cup. "Remember that Sunday dinner? When I couldn't eat, couldn't speak, and Dad said I was just being dramatic?" The memory hit Helena like a physical blow. She remembered that dinner clearly now, Miguel pushing food around his plate, her husband's frustrated voice, her own silence that felt like betrayal in retrospect. "I failed you," Helena whispered, tears mixing with the raindrops on her cheeks. "I didn't want to believe something was really wrong. It was easier to think you were just going through a phase." Carlos leaned against the wall, providing silent support while keeping enough distance to allow this necessary conversation to unfold. His presence somehow made the space feel safer, like a neutral ground where truth could finally emerge. Miguel's voice grew stronger as he continued. "The streets. They didn't judge me. When I couldn't get out of my makeshift bed for days, no one told me to just get over it. Other homeless people understood pain differently. They'd share their food even when they had nothing, sit with me in silence when words were too heavy. He described the community he'd found, the unexpected kindness in forgotten corners of the city. The freedom to exist without pretense, to be broken without shame. As he spoke, Helena began to see the streets through different eyes, not just as the dangerous place she'd feared had swallowed her son, but as the sanctuary it had become for him. "I couldn't bear the weight of your expectations," Miguel said, meeting his mother's eyes for the first time. "Every morning, putting on that suit, pretending I was okay, it was killing me slowly. Out here, I could finally breathe." Carlos stepped forward slightly, sharing his own story of hitting rock bottom years ago before building himself back up. "Sometimes," he said, "we have to lose everything to find ourselves." Helena wiped her eyes, years of guilt and misunderstanding pouring out. "I'm so sorry, Miguel. I was supposed to protect you to understand. Instead, I made you feel like you had to run away to find peace." Miguel's shoulders relaxed slightly at her words. He described the years that followed his departure, the initial terror of street life, the gradual adaptation, the unexpected moments of joy he'd found in his new freedom. Helena listened intently, really listened, perhaps for the first time. "I learned to manage the depression differently out here," he explained. "Without the pressure to be normal, I could focus on just surviving each day. Sometimes that was enough." A tentative smile crossed Helena's face as she began to understand. Her son hadn't just disappeared. He'd found a different way to live, to cope, to be. The street hadn't destroyed him. In its own way, it had saved him. As the rain began to ease, Miguel and Helena shared their first genuine embrace in years. It was brief but real, free from the pretense that had marked their previous relationship. Carlos watched with quiet satisfaction as mother and son began to bridge the chasm between their worlds. "Maybe," said Carlos, "there's a way to belong to both worlds." The words hung in the air as Miguel considered them. The rain had softened to a gentle drizzle, creating a misty halo around the streetlights that were beginning to flicker on. "There was a woman on the streets," Miguel said, his voice stronger now. "Maria. She used to be a teacher before mental illness took everything from her. She taught me that healing doesn't always look the way people expect it to." Helena shifted closer, hanging on every word. The movement was subtle, careful, as if she was afraid any sudden motion might shatter this fragile moment of connection. "Maria would sit with me during the worst days," he continued. "She showed me how to find beauty in broken things, how to build a life without walls or schedules or suffocating expectations." Carlos nodded knowingly, having seen countless stories of redemption and reconstruction in his years running the barbershop. Sometimes the greatest strength is in choosing your own path, even when nobody else understands it. Miguel pulled out a worn photograph from his pocket, a group of street people sharing a meal around a makeshift table. "This is my family too," he said, showing it to Helena. "They never asked me to be anything other than what I am." Helena's fingers trembled as she took the photo, studying the faces of those who had cared for her son when she couldn't or wouldn't understand how to. The genuine smiles in the picture challenged everything she'd assumed about life on the streets. "I don't need fixing," Miguel said firmly, but without anger. "I needed acceptance. Out here, I found people who understood that sadness can be part of who you are without defining everything you are." Thunder rumbled in the distance, but the worst of the storm had passed. Like the weather, the tension between mother and son had shifted from a torrential downpour to a gentle clearing. "Perhaps," Helena said softly, "it's me who needed to change, not you." The truth of those words settled between them, bringing with it the first real possibility of a new kind of relationship, one built on understanding rather than expectations. "Maybe," said Carlos, "there's a way to belong to both worlds." Carlos watched Miguel and Helena sitting across from each other in the empty barbershop, the morning light streaming through the windows. The tension from the previous night's confrontation still lingered in the air, but something had shifted. It was time to present his idea. "I've been thinking," Carlos began, pulling up a chair between them. "The barbershop has been growing, and I could use an extra pair of hands." He looked directly at Miguel. "How would you feel about working here? Part-time on your own terms." Miguel's eyes widened slightly, his fingers unconsciously touching the fresh haircut Carlos had given him days ago. Helena held her breath, careful not to push, remembering the lessons from their emotional conversation during the storm. I don't know anything about cutting hair," Miguel muttered, but Carlos could see a spark of interest in his eyes. "Everyone starts somewhere. Besides, you'd start with simple tasks. Sweeping, preparing tools, learning by watching. No pressure." The next morning, Miguel showed up at the barber shop before opening hours. Carlos noticed he was wearing the same clothes, but they were cleaner, and he'd made an effort to maintain his groomed appearance. The first day was spent learning the basics, the names of tools, proper sanitization, the rhythm of the shop. Customers who'd seen Miguel's viral transformation photo started coming in, curious about the man who'd made headlines. Instead of feeling threatened, Miguel found himself sharing small bits of his story, surprising himself with how natural it felt. During lunch break, Helena appeared at the door carrying a brown paper bag. "I made extra," she said simply, placing it on the counter. Miguel stared at the bag for a long moment before opening it to find his childhood favorite, chicken empanadas. The awkwardness was palpable as they shared the meal, decades of absence hanging between them, but they managed small talk about the weather and the barbershop's daily operations. As days passed, Miguel developed a routine. He'd spend mornings at the barbershop, learning from Carlos, who proved to be a patient teacher. In the afternoons, he'd return to his familiar streets, maintaining the freedom he'd grown accustomed to. The arrangement allowed him to keep his independence while building bridges to his past life. "Watch how I angle the scissors," Carlos demonstrated one quiet afternoon. Miguel observed intently, his hands mimicking the movement without tools. A regular customer, Mr. Rodriguez, watched the interaction with a smile. "You know," Mr. Rodriguez said, "my father was a barber. He always said it's not just about cutting hair, it's about restoring dignity." Miguel's hands stopped mid-motion, those words striking a chord. He thought about how a simple haircut had changed his own life's trajectory. The local community began embracing Miguel's presence in the barbershop. Some even brought coffee or snacks, leaving them casually on the counter. The space became more than just a business. It transformed into a sanctuary where different worlds could coexist. One particularly busy Saturday, a young man walked in, his clothes worn and dirty. Miguel recognized the look in his eyes. He'd seen it in his own reflection countless times. Before Carlos could react, Miguel stepped forward. "Would you like a coffee while you wait?" he offered, gesturing to the chair near the window. The young man's shoulders relaxed slightly, and Miguel saw Carlos nodding approvingly from across the room. Helena visited more frequently, but never stayed too long. She was learning to respect Miguel's boundaries while making her presence felt in subtle ways. A fresh towel here, a new coffee mug there. The dance of reformation between mother and son played out in these small gestures. As weeks passed, Carlos began teaching Miguel basic haircuts. His hands, once unsure, grew steadier with each practice session. The mirror that had once revealed his hidden identity now reflected a man finding his purpose. "You have a natural talent," Carlos commented one evening as Miguel successfully completed his first basic trim on a practice mannequin. "It's in the way you read people, how you make them comfortable." Miguel continued living on the streets, but something had changed. He had a place to belong during the day, a bridge between his two worlds. Some nights, he'd sit in his usual spot under the stars, reflecting on how life had shifted since that first haircut. Regular customers began requesting Miguel to assist with their services, first for simple tasks, then for basic trims under Carlos's supervision. Each small success built his confidence, each interaction healing old wounds. Helena watched from the doorway one afternoon as her son carefully swept the floor between clients, chatting easily with waiting customers. She pulled out her phone and checked her calendar, making a decision. "I'd like to schedule an appointment," she said, her voice carrying across the shop. "With my son, if possible." Miguel froze mid-sweep, his hands tightening around the broom handle. Carlos glanced between mother and son, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I'm not ready for that yet," Miguel stammered, but Helena was already writing her name in the appointment book. "Next week will be fine," she said softly. "That should give you enough time to practice." Her eyes met her son's, carrying both challenge and trust. The other customers in the shop pretended to be absorbed in their magazines, but their attention was focused on the scene unfolding before them. One elderly man wiped his eyes discreetly with his handkerchief. Outside the barber shop, a small group of homeless people had gathered, pressing their faces against the glass. They were Miguel's street family, the ones who had taken him in when he'd first disappeared. Now they watched him with pride, their presence a reminder that he hadn't abandoned them. "Your street friends," Carlos said, nodding toward the window. "They could use haircuts too. Maybe that could be your specialty, giving back to the community that helped you." Miguel looked at the faces in the window, then at his mother's name in the appointment book, and finally at his own reflection in the mirror. The man staring back at him wasn't just a street person anymore, nor was he the troubled young man who'd fled his family. He was becoming something new, a bridge between worlds. Helena scheduled her appointment for next Thursday at 2 p.m. Miguel's hands trembled slightly as he arranged the tools on the counter for the third time. The morning sun filtered through the barbershop's window, casting long shadows across the freshly swept floor. Carlos watched him with a mixture of amusement and understanding, approaching quietly from behind. "The scissors won't arrange themselves any better than they already are," Carlos said, placing a reassuring hand on Miguel's shoulder. "You've been doing this for weeks now. This client is no different." But they both knew that wasn't true. This wasn't just another client. This was Helena, his mother, and this would be the first time he would cut her hair. The significance of the moment wasn't lost on either of them. "What if I mess up?" Miguel whispered, adjusting the chair's height unnecessarily. "You won't," Carlos replied, demonstrating one last time the technique they'd practiced. "Remember, just like we discussed, gentle with the layers, careful around the ears." The bell above the door chimed, and Miguel's heart skipped a beat. Helena stood in the doorway, her silver-streaked hair catching the morning light. She wore a simple blue dress and her hands clutched her purse tightly. She was just as nervous as he was. "Good morning," she said softly, her eyes meeting Miguel's in the mirror. Miguel took a deep breath and gestured to the chair. "Please, sit down." His voice was steady, more professional than he felt. As Helena settled into the chair, he caught a whiff of her perfume, the same one she'd worn throughout his childhood. Memories flooded back, sitting on the bathroom counter while she trimmed his bangs, laughing as she tried to tame his cowlick the way she'd hum while working with the scissors. His hands moved automatically, draping the cape around her shoulders. Through the mirror, he could see other clients watching discreetly, some smiling, others pretending to read magazines while stealing glances at the unfolding scene. "How would you like it?" Miguel asked, running his fingers through her hair professionally, just as Carlos had taught him. "I trust you," Helena replied, and those 3 words carried the weight of years of absence and hope. As Miguel began to work, muscle memory took over. The nervous energy transformed into focused precision. He found himself falling into a rhythm, the soft snip of the scissors creating a peaceful melody in the quiet shop. Carlos moved about, helping other clients but keeping a watchful eye on his protégé. "Do you remember?" Helena began hesitantly. "How you used to sit on that little stool in the bathroom while I cut your hair?" Miguel's hands paused briefly. "You always promised me ice cream after if I sat still," he replied, a small smile playing at his lips. "You never did sit still," she chuckled, and for a moment the years between them seemed to dissolve. Through the window, Miguel noticed several familiar faces, his friends from the streets, peeking in. They gave him encouraging nods, their presence a reminder that he belonged to both worlds now. One didn't have to exclude the other. As he worked, Miguel found himself sharing small details about his new life, his favorite clients, the techniques he was learning, the satisfaction of helping others feel better about themselves. Helena listened intently, her eyes never leaving his reflection in the mirror. The transformation was subtle, but significant. Each careful snip seemed to cut away at the tension between them, each gentle touch a small step toward healing. Carlos had been right. The barbershop was more than just a place of work. It was a bridge between his past and present. When Miguel finally stepped back to assess his work, he felt a surge of pride. The cut was perfect, professional yet personal, modern but suitable for his mother. Helena's eyes welled up as she examined her reflection, but her smile was radiant. "It's beautiful," she whispered, touching the sides gently. The other clients in the shop burst into spontaneous applause, causing Miguel to blush and Helena to laugh through her tears. Carlos beamed from his station, nodding in approval. As Helena stood up, she reached for her purse, but Miguel shook his head. "This one's on me," he said softly. They shared a look of understanding. This had been about much more than a haircut. "Tomorrow," Miguel said, gathering his courage, "I want to show you where I live now." Helena's eyes widened slightly at his words, but her smile remained genuine. She reached up and touched her newly styled hair, using the gesture to compose herself. Around them, the barbershop continued its daily rhythm, but the energy had shifted. The regular clients who had witnessed this reunion seemed to move more quietly, respectfully, as if acknowledging the gravity of the moment. A young mother with her child entered the shop, and Miguel turned to greet them professionally, seamlessly stepping into his role as a barber. Helena watched him work, noticing how naturally he interacted with the customers, how at ease he seemed in this space that bridged his two worlds. Before leaving, she paused at the door, looking back at her son. The morning sun highlighted his features that had once been hidden beneath years of untamed hair and beard, features that reminded her so much of his father. But now there was something else there too, peace, perhaps, or acceptance. "I'll come by tomorrow then," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. Miguel nodded, cleaning his station as Carlos had taught him. "Meet me here at 10, he replied. "I'll show you everything." As Helena stepped out into the bright morning, Miguel caught his reflection in the mirror. The man staring back at him wasn't the same person who had first entered this shop. He was someone new, someone who had found a way to honor both his past and his present. Carlos approached him, placing a fresh towel on his station. "You did good, kid," he said simply, but his eyes conveyed much more. The rest of the day passed in a blur of clients and conversations, but Miguel's mind kept returning to tomorrow. For the first time in years, he felt ready to share his whole truth with his mother, not just the polished version visible in the barbershop, but the raw reality of his chosen life on the streets. It was time for both of their worlds to truly meet. "Tomorrow," he said to himself as he swept up the day's last clippings, "I want to show you where I live now." The morning sun cast long shadows across the city streets as Miguel led Helena through the maze of alleys and hidden corners that had become his home. His steps were confident now, a stark contrast to the hesitation he'd shown in the barbershop just days before. Each location held a story, a memory, a piece of the life he'd built for himself over the past decade. "This is where I usually sleep," Miguel said, pointing to a well-protected alcove beneath an old building's overhang. The space was neat, with a carefully arranged cardboard bed and a small collection of essential items stored in a waterproof bag. Helena's eyes welled with tears, but not from shame or pity, from understanding. Her son had created order within chaos. As they walked, familiar faces emerged from doorways and behind corners. "This is Roberto," Miguel introduced an elderly man with kind eyes. "He taught me how to survive my first winter on the streets." Roberto clasped Helena's hand warmly, speaking of how her son had become a respected figure in their community, helping newcomers and sharing whatever he had. "And Maria," Miguel continued, gesturing to a woman tending to a small container garden in a hidden courtyard. "She grows herbs here, keeps us all healthy with her teas." Maria embraced Helena like an old friend, pulling out a small chair for her to sit. The morning unfolded like a guided tour through an invisible city that existed parallel to the one Helena had always known. Each person they met shared stories about Miguel, how he'd helped during hard times, his quiet strength, his ability to find beauty in their harsh reality. Carlos appeared around midday, carrying a thermos of fresh coffee and paper cups. "I thought you might need a break," he smiled, pouring the aromatic brew. The three of them sat on a clean patch of concrete, surrounded by Miguel's street family, sharing coffee and conversation as if they were in the finest cafe in town. "This is my morning route," Miguel explained, tracing a path on an imaginary map. "I know where to find work when I need it, where to get food, where to stay safe." Helena listened intently, beginning to see the strategic thinking behind what she'd once thought was aimless wandering. They made their way to a small plaza where several of Miguel's friends had prepared a surprise lunch. Simple sandwiches and fruit were laid out on a clean blanket, a feast by street standards. Helena watched as her son moved comfortably among his chosen family, directing the informal gathering with natural leadership. "I have plans," Miguel shared as they ate. "Carlos is teaching me more about cutting hair. I want to bring these skills to the streets, help others feel human again, like he did for me." His eyes sparkled with purpose. "Maybe once a week we could set up a street station, offer free haircuts to those who need them." The barber shop had indeed become his bridge between worlds. 3 days a week, he worked with Carlos, building a legitimate career. The other days, he remained in his street community, maintaining the connections and freedom he'd found there. Helena sat with a group of women who shared their own stories of how they'd come to the streets, their dreams, their daily victories. She saw them not as homeless people, but as survivors, each with their own complex history. Her son had found his place among them, and for the first time, she felt no urge to change that. As the afternoon wound down, Carlos unveiled his surprise, a portable barber's chair, compact enough to carry but sturdy enough to use. "For your street salon," he said simply, watching Miguel's face light up at the possibility of combining both his worlds. The golden light of sunset painted the plaza in warm hues as the impromptu gathering continued. Miguel moved between groups, equally at ease with his street family and his blood relations. He paused to watch his mother deepen conversation with Maria about her herb garden, while Carlos demonstrated the features of the portable chair to an interested group of onlookers. Miguel smiled, watching his mother chat with his street friends, while Carlos prepared the portable barber chair, his gift to bring hope to others who, like him, had chosen the streets as home. The portable chair became the centerpiece of the gathering, with several people taking turns sitting in it, while Miguel explained his vision. "We'll start in this plaza," he said, his hands moving animatedly. "Every Sunday morning when the city is quiet, anyone who needs a haircut can come." Helena watched her son in his element, noticing how his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, just like they did when he was a boy. But this wasn't the same person who had fled their home all those years ago. This was a man who had found his purpose, who had built something meaningful from his struggles. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the plaza, people began to drift away with warm hugs and promises to return for Miguel's first street barbershop session. Carlos packed up the portable chair, showing Miguel how to fold it properly for storage. "You've built something beautiful here," Helena said softly, touching her son's arm. "I wish I had understood sooner." Miguel squeezed her hand. "We both needed time to find our way here," he replied. "Sometimes the longest journeys lead us exactly where we need to be." The plaza grew quiet as twilight settled in. A few of Miguel's closest street friends remained, sharing stories and laughter around a small battery-powered lamp. Helena sat among them, no longer an outsider looking in, but part of this extended family her son had created. The night ended with plans for the future: Sunday morning haircuts, weekly family dinners that would include both blood relations and street family, and a promise that Miguel would continue to bridge his two worlds in his own way, at his own pace. As the last rays of sunlight faded, Miguel stood in the center of his two families, the one he was born into and the one he had chosen, feeling, for the first time in years, truly whole. The portable chair stood ready for its first day of service, a symbol of hope and transformation. Much like the chance Carlos had given him that first day in the barbershop.